and Popper and Critical Rationalism, lecture 19. I guess for you guys, it probably feels like many, many more than that. And today I'm going to be talking about the philosophy of social science. During the course of the lectures, I've made a certain number of comments about Popper's ideas on the philosophy of social science. Here, I'm going to try to pull things together in a more systematic manner. First of all, an important biographical point concerning Popper. Popper in this area is often treated just alongside Friedrich Hayek, but a key difference between them is that Hayek was an economist and also in Vienna a member of Ludwig von Mises's private seminar, and also a member of other seminars in which methodological issues in the social sciences were discussed. Popper, by contrast, wasn't a social scientist. His background was in Marxism and then gradually a critical reaction against it. But then he was working in psychology, in mathematics, in science, and in philosophy, while Hayek, along earlier with Kaufmann, was an important source of information to him about some issues in the methodology of social science. It seems to me simply to be a mistake to treat Popper as coming out of the same background, or as I'm repeatedly finding when I've been doing research in this area in preparation for the present lecture, calling him a neoliberal. I mean, if I were given £1 even for each time I've seen him described as this, I would be a rich man. Popper's ideas about the philosophy of social science seem to start with his early espousal of, and then in different ways, critical reaction against Marxism. There seem to have been three elements in this. First, Popper's developing ideas about what characterizes science. This took place over time. It's not distinctive to his ideas about social science. And so unless people want to ask me about this in the question period and discussion period, I'm not going to discuss it in this lecture. If you're interested in this, you need to look back to the earlier lectures. Second, there were Popper's ideas about explanation and the use that he made of these ideas in the criticism of what he called historicism. And then there were Popper's more general ideas about historicism, and their questions here about their status and also what the substance of these ideas was. I'm going to be discussing these things in what are broadly the second and third sections of the lecture. What about methodological individualism? There are different elements involved here. First of all, there's the impact on Popper of Karl Polanyi's ideas about methodological nominalism, which Popper, once he becomes aware of them, comes to interpret in terms of Hayek's ideas about methodological individualism. That's to say, the impact of Polanyi came first. Popper makes a number of programmatic statements about nominalism and methodological nominalism, but then in the course of the poverty of historicism, he then, and in some ways, somewhat surprisingly, given the differences in background and approach between Polanyi and Hayek, actually then cashes these things out in terms which draw on Hayek's ideas, which Popper came across later about methodological individualism. And there is also an impact by Polanyi on Popper in terms of his stress on Marxism as an approach to the study of the unintended consequences of human action. Second, there is a stress here. Popper is saying that he's following what he finds in Marx on the social and institutional setting of human action, which he contrasts with what he calls psychologism, the attempt really to explain society reductively in psychologistic terms. And then there is a reinterpretation of certain of Hayek's ideas about the methodology of economics in the light of Popper's ideas about epistemology and explanation. So all of this stuff is to be found together as feeding into Popper's treatment of methodological individualism. These ideas are then elaborated in terms of what Popper calls situational logic. But two elements about it seem to me to be left a bit unclear. First of all, how is Popper suggesting that we should understand people's situations? Different ideas are floated here, but he doesn't really indicate how and when or whether we should choose between them. And what I have in mind here are ideas about people acting on the basis of a situation as they understood it, or that we should approach them trying to understand them as acting rationally in relation to either the situation, how it was, or the situation as they could have become knowledgeable about it had they tried to do so. So there's this kind of ambiguity in Popper's approach. And then second, there's the issue of what Popper's approach in all of this means in terms of the actual methodology of social science. Are we being offered a so-called rational choice approach, a bit like you get in microeconomics, and then extended to rational choice explanations in political science and in some areas of sociology? Or are we being given something that is closer to the sort of approach you get in parts of Max Weber, where basically our task is to understand what people's ideas and motivation was, and then to look at what the unintended consequences would be of people acting on the basis of that. There are two issues. First of all, how does the notion of the rationality principle relate to Popper's ideas about explanation more generally? And there is also then the issue which Popper addresses in his paper Models, Instruments, and Truth about the status of the rationality principle. And one can ask how what he says there relates to ideas about conventionalism, which I discussed in earlier lectures in connection with Lakatos and Spiro Latsis. There's also the issue of Popper's opposition to psychologism, and of whether for Popper it's legitimate to have recourse to psychological theories in the social sciences at all. I will start the lecture itself, that's to say, beyond the introduction, by saying something about the poverty of historicism. I'll do this just because it contains what in some ways is Popper's most systematic discussion of the topic of the philosophy of social science. Although, as I shall explain, there seem to me to be some problems about it as a book or as a systematic treatment. Well then, the poverty of historicism. As I mentioned before, Popper gave a couple of talks under this title, which he developed by way of a kind of play of words on Marx's The Poverty of Philosophy. He gave a couple of talks under this title in the 1930s, one in Brussels and the other at the LSE. And he did this before going to work in New Zealand. He then worked on the paper, The Poverty of Historicism, getting assistance from, amongst other people, the economist Colin Simkin. Popper submitted the paper to Mind, but it was rejected. He then worked on it further, and he made some changes to the latter part of it in the light of offprints which Hayek had sent him, which related a bit to issues in the philosophy of social science. In addition, the first part of The Poverty of Historicism was cut with Popper's general agreement by Hayek in order to fit into the limited space that was available in the journal Economica, of which Hayek was the editor. Popper had agreed to Hayek making some cuts to it, but because of the communications difficulties during the wartime period between Britain and New Zealand, Hayek wasn't able to consult with him about the details of these things. If you're burning to know what they were, I had permission to reproduce them in a paper, and I'll give a reference to that in the notes of this lecture. I wouldn't say that they're anything to get excited about, but in point of fact, there were these cuts made. It also seems to me important to bear in mind that when Popper wrote the material that forms the poverty, he had a limited view of what was open to rational appraisal. And as I've explained before, at the time of writing The Logic of Scientific Discovery, and then indeed both the poverty and in most respects the open society, what was open to rational appraisal was basically stuff which was empirical, formal, or methodological in Popper's view, but not metaphysics or ethics. And one consequence of this was that, in my view, arguments which would, in terms of Popper's later work, would have been better presented in the context of critical discussion of the substance of different metaphysical research programs in the social sciences, were presented instead as if they were just abstract issues of methodology. Two influences are also worth referring to explicitly: Karl Polanyi and Friedrich Hayek. Polanyi and Hayek are often, and I think correctly, seen as being strongly at odds with one another on issues to do with social philosophy. But in this context, the thrust of their influence on Popper actually ran down similar kinds of lines. For Popper seems to have taken out of a private discussion with Polanyi in the 1920s the idea that the social sciences should be what Popper refers to as methodologically nominalist. And then, when he came across it later, Popper understood Hayek's methodological individualism as giving an exemplar of a similar kind of approach. The book, The Poverty of Historicism, has a rather odd structure. At its center is a critique of the idea of historicism. This is basically a term that Popper invented for his own purposes. This has given rise to a great deal of confusion, just on the grounds that people had taken it, despite what Popper said, to be a translation of the term that is often translated as historism in English, namely ideas about either, if you like, historical relativity, or seeing ideas in terms just of the circumstances in which they arose. And basically, I mean, for example, Herbert Marcuse wrote a review of The Poverty of Historicism, where he talked where he took Popper to be talking about historism in this sense and couldn't understand his characterization of it. Popper invented the term for his own use. And the heart of it is the idea that there is an objective telos or purpose to history, something that you can see in Christian ideas about divine providence, or in Hegel's view about the way in which a kind of purpose running through history and the history of disciplines and world history and so on can be understood retrospectively, or the way in which this Hegelian notion was reinterpreted by Marx and understood by him in such a way that one could indeed anticipate where it was going. So at the heart of Popper's treatment, there is a rejection of the idea that there is an objective telos to history. And Popper also refers to various other Marxist influenced approaches, in some cases to things which were seen at the time as being orthodox forms of Marxism, and in other cases, things which were simply in certain ways influenced by Marxism, like the work of Karl Mannheim. He also, however, takes to task Auguste Comte and John Stuart Mill for historicist ideas in their work. But he addresses these things with, within a broad structure which contrasted views which supposedly drew on methods thought to characterize the natural sciences, and ones which argued that the social sciences were radically different. So Popper himself offers not an engagement with the ideas of other theorists. Excuse me, I'm getting sound interference from someone else. Could you put yourself on mute, please? Popper basically offers a reconstruction of different kinds of arguments for historicism, rather than just engaging directly with the ideas of historicists. Excuse me, I'm getting someone singing. Could you please mute yourself? Excuse me.
Jeremy, you can put everyone on mute.
Yes, I am. Sorry, I've just put everyone on mute to get over this. Okay. So he has the structure of his book makes use of the notion that historicist ideas could be, as it were, reconstructed to fit in with two different kinds of approach. I'd have thought that Popper would have done much better had he just concerned himself with the methodological ideas that informed contemporary Marxism at its strongest, because in some ways, Marxism was a target of his, and I think that actually his argument becomes weaker just because of the scatter of things and the degree to which he's offering his own reconstructions rather than engaging with people directly. Now, Popper in the Open Society reports that in 1925, he had conversations with Karl Polanyi about the methodology of the social sciences. Polanyi, in fact, had been invited initially to give some talks at the university by Popper's uncle, Walter Schiff. The meetings, because there was a lack of uptake of people who came to listen to him, shifted to Polanyi's apartment. But they started off, and there may have been the connection with Popper by way of his uncle. Popper describes Polanyi as having contrasted the essentialist methods of the social sciences with what was referred to as the nominalist methods of the physical sciences, and I quote, as pointing out at that time that a reform of the methodology of the social sciences might conceivably be achieved by abandoning this essentialist approach. It is this approach which, in the Poverty, Popper came to identify with methodological individualism in the form in which this was championed by Hayek. As I've already indicated, this might seem strange, as Polanyi was, at the very time when he met with Popper, engaged in an argument with Ludwig von Mises about the possibility of economic calculation under socialism. And Hayek was himself someone who took that argument further, essentially developing Mises' side of the argument. Polanyi is, in his contributions to this discussion, championed a form of guild socialism. However, his economic analysis seems to have been marginalist, that's to say, broadly the same as that of Mises, and indeed, Polanyi has been criticized for taking this kind of approach by later socialist writers. But at any rate, there seems to be this sort of slightly odd input from two directions, each of which had been influenced by the Austrian form of marginalism into what Popper came to call methodological nominalism. Popper's also mentioned that in the previous year, again in private conversations, Polanyi had stressed to him the way in which Marx could be understood as being concerned with the unintended consequences of human action. And it is, as it were, as if Popper picks up methodological individualism and unintended consequences, which become important motifs in his approach. We need, however, also to note explicitly three features of Popper's own approach to methodological individualism. The first is that, as I've mentioned previously, Popper makes common cause with Marx in seeing acting individuals as socially and institutionally situated, something that marginalist economists, I think if you press them, they would say this is the case, but they didn't make a big deal out of it. This leads to a second point. Popper is strongly opposed to an approach which sees explanation in the social sciences as having to be based on individual psychology. He is happy enough to see psychology as a useful social science, but on his account, it's social, not naturalistic, and what plays a key role in explanation in the social sciences is not so much psychology, but rather what Popper was to call the rationality principle. A third theme of Popper's methodological individualism is that he makes common cause with Hayek, and certainly Hayek's reading of Karl Menger, in endorsing what they called the compositive approach in the social sciences. That's to say that we should build up an understanding of what we're trying to explain in society by, as it were, constructing this on the basis of individual actions. Popper accompanies discussion of this by arguing that we are involved in the construction of models in the social sciences, and takes this to the point of talking about, for example, the war or the army as abstract objects and theoretical constructions. All this seems to me in some ways problematic. First, there's a sense in which ideas like a war and the army are also constitutive of individuals' actions. This is an aspect of Popper's own stress on the social or institutional character of our actions. If someone is, for example, on guard duty outside a military base, ideas about the army and his position in it and his role in it go to make up and to render intelligible what he's doing. Popper is clearly right in the sense that the soldier may well have internalized ideas which include theories which are false, for example, about how the army works. But it's nonetheless the case that he's likely to be acting on the basis of these mistaken ideas. It also seems to me that there's something wrong with Hayek's account of the methods of the social sciences as being compositive. Rather, I would have thought it would be better to think of them as resoluto-compositive. By this, I mean that one starts with social phenomena in which one is interested and then tries to break them down and then build up again to a better understanding of them. Why do I stress this? Well, just because of the way in which our actions have unintended social consequences. We may often find ourselves in situations which are strange or even baffling. If, say, someone is in the middle of an economic slump or is in an economy that's suffering from inflation, there's something taking place of which they're aware, but which they may typically feel that they don't understand. And the key role of the social sciences is surely to start from such problems and to try to throw light on them by way of compositive analysis, where this may obviously correct the kind of crude understandings from which we initially start. At one level, we are each. Sorry, it's also worth noting that it's not obvious from what we should start. At one level, we are each named individuals, and there is a sense in which a unity is given to us at any moment by the basis on which we're acting. That's to say, whatever else is going on when we perform an action, one can concentrate on the fact that we are doing that. But clearly, we need to make a decision as to whether we should probe beneath the level of a specific action by an individual. I mean, they're interesting pictures of individuals as being something like committees with different people, as it were, pushing different approaches, and they're then acting in a particular way, which is an outcome of these sorts of concerns or forces. And we can ask, well, should it be our concern to probe back into that? But clearly, we need to take a specific decision as to whether we want to go in for such probing and, for example, to consider personality dynamics or how one impulse or plan won out over others. One might say, well, okay, but this sort of deconstruction of the individual is interesting enough, but it's hardly something with which we need to be concerned. If what interests us is the action that's performed and its consequences, deliberate or unintended. Although clearly, to the degree to which we accord individual choice some ethical or social significance, we may be led back to these issues. For example, to what extent can we take individual choice as actually tracking the interest and well-being of the individual, for example, either directly or in terms of the consequences of these things.
There's a pair of glasses.
I'm sorry, someone has unmuted themselves and is talking. Could you please mute yourself? But it is also worth noting an issue that I raised in an earlier lecture. At what level of abstraction or aggregation should we work if we wish to explain some social phenomena? This is hardly settled by invoking what we're immediately familiar with. For the social sciences work not with named individuals as they stand at particular points of time, but rather with models of individual agency, where it is a moot point what motives and what knowledge we should attribute to them. As I've argued before, with reference, you might recall, to Duhem and to Lionel Robbins, self-evidence at the level of what individuals are doing doesn't really help us here, because how we should represent such individuals is underdetermined by whatever information of this kind we might have access to. And it looks to me as if all that can help us here is the explanatory adequacy of the model. So just to try to convey this again, possibly rather more clearly, the key issue is this: methodological individualism directs us towards acting individuals. We know ourselves and other people to be acting. What isn't explained by simply talking about methodological individualism is how we should be represented. To what extent should there be aggregation of different individuals? In what broad terms is it appropriate to describe them, and so on? Anti-essentialism, on Popper's account, amounts to more than an espousal of methodological individualism or methodological nominalism. Popper, it seems to me, puts together a number of different things in his discussion. One of them is a repudiation of the idea that we should operate by considering a term as we might normally use it, such as the state, and seeking out what the state is essentially, and developing a social science which deals with the behavior of such essences of things. Second, Popper is critical of methodological approaches which seek to deal with the behavior of social wholes across time. There is a parallel here, if people know Max Weber's work, of his criticisms of the organic approaches of the so-called older historical school in German economics to the development of nations, which tended to treat them a little bit as being like plants that develop over time and at a certain point flourish and then conceivably decay. However, as I've indicated in an earlier lecture, I think that Popper in this area really throws the baby out with the bathwater when he discards essentialism. For it seems to me not only to be perfectly sensible to claim that, as a consequence of and as sustained by individual action, there can exist structures in society which serve to constrain us as individual agents, but that what these are may change over time, and that in consequence, one may need to discuss such constraints in a way that is time limited, relating to the presence or absence of the things or structures in question. Not only may these things have characteristics which constrain us as individuals, but if their character is indeed something that is constituted by the unintended consequences of human action, what these things are like may not be disclosed directly by a study of people's preferences and motives. Although clearly people may come to take on distinctive motivations as a consequence of adjusting to these things. One can thus, I'd suggest, perfectly legitimately develop a realist social science, the status of which parallels in some ways the conjectural realism to be found in Popper's ordinary philosophy of science. One related issue about all this is that it seems to me to throw light on one slightly strange feature of Popper's Poverty of Historicism. It is that while in some respects one can read the book as a critical engagement with Marxism, and where Popper's discussion of historical prophecy does relate directly to this, he seems to me to have taken an odd tack by trying to go for wider methodological errors, which are, in his view, shared by others too. In part, this is doubtless related to the restricted ideas about rational appraisal, which he had at the time, so that in a certain sense, the only legitimate arrow that he could put into his bow to shoot people with was methodology. But it had some odd consequences. The first is that in a book which in many respects had practical concerns, it spent a lot of time in critical discussion with aspects of the work of Auguste Comte and of John Stuart Mill. Indeed, there's an odd parallel here in Friedrich Hayek's work, that he wrote a book called The Counter-Revolution of Science. And in this, he spent a lot of time beating up on the ideas of Auguste Comte and of his followers, when in fact there were contemporaries who had pretty much the same kind of ideas, but who I suspect wouldn't have recognized that there was this parallel with Comte. And so you have in two people writing separately engagements with Auguste Comte at a time when pretty much no one had got any real interest in his work. That's to say, it's not clear that these things which Popper discusses at some length was something that anyone really at the time was that much interested in. And he also discusses historicist themes in Plato, which again are of little more than purely scholarly interest as to whether or not this is the case. I mean, Popper could say, well, there are practical ways in which there are parallels between Plato and some current developments. And he gave a lecture on this in which he said that there were some odd resemblances between some corners of Plato's ideas and those of Hitler. But it wasn't in respect of this stuff which got discussed in the Poverty of Historicism. While it seems to me failing to engage directly with some of the key themes in Marxism, that's to say, the idea that there were particular characteristics to capitalism as an economic structure which had a temporary character to it, seemed to me to be a weakness in Popper's work. I'm not saying that the Marxist claims about this were correct, but it seems to me odd that Popper didn't just argue head-on against some of the more obvious and at the time influential examples of the kind of things that he was criticizing. It just seems to me to be a rather strange feature of the book. Next, explanation. In the course of the Poverty of Historicism and also in the Open Society, Popper reminds us about the approach to explanation that he developed in the logic of scientific discovery. This plays a twofold role in relation to his arguments about the philosophy of social science. The first relates to his criticism of what he deemed to be historical prophecy on the part, for example, of a number of Marxist writers. Popper's view was that Marxism and some other approaches were characterized by the view that it was their task to disclose, as it were, the historical trajectory of society, where it was going through history, and that this was mistakenly understood by them as having an unconditional character to it. Popper, in addressing this, was able to argue that his own analysis of causal explanation brought out the way in which explanations depend not just on laws, but also on statements of so-called initial conditions as well, with the consequence that prediction can be properly understood to have a conditional character. It is, however, worth noting that in the Poverty, Popper, after discussing the difference on this score between trends and laws, also refers to what he calls explained trends. That's to say, trends which are shown to depend on the persistence of certain initial conditions, as well as there being laws in the background. And it's my suspicion that in the face of this, a Marxist would typically have been able to recast what he or she wished to argue in just those terms. This obviously wouldn't show that the Marxist claims were actually correct, but it would add, I think, to my earlier case that Popper would have done better to engage with the substance of Marxism's claims rather than by trying to argue in a much more general way at the level of methodology. It might also be noted that the Marxist writer Rosa Luxemburg is well known for having claimed that what she called capitalist civilization faces a choice, that between socialism or barbarism, which would certainly indicate that in her view there was an element of conditionality here rather than unconditional prophecy. But in fact, the Marxist pedigree of her claim has been contested. She obviously thought that she was quoting a standard claim to be found in Engels, but in fact, it's actually made in by someone that Engels was criticizing. So the ability to use this as a point against Popper seems to me to be somewhat limited. The other aspect of Popper's ideas about explanation relates to the use of the rationality principle and situational logic. Popper discusses the use of rationality in explanations in the social sciences in both the Poverty and the Open Society, but his fullest treatment is given in Models, Instruments, and Truth, which is to be found in The Myth of the Framework. The idea here is that one can make use of the assumption that an agent acts rationally in the situation in which they're acting within an explanation of the same structure as Popper developed for explanation in the sciences. That's to say that the rationality principle can play the same sort of animating role as does a general law in the natural sciences. One might see what is going on here as Popper making use of the kind of explanation that Hayek offered as an account of how microeconomics works, in which individuals act in ways that are subjectively rational to them, but as giving it a reinterpretation in terms of his own epistemology. That's to say, Popper argues that we should treat an explanation as an objective logical structure with deducibility of a statement of what we wish to explain from our premises, which should themselves be testable. It's interesting that in The Poverty, Popper is critical of people who took the view that there was a difference between the social and the natural sciences relating to ideas about Verstehen or sympathetic understanding. And he has suggested from then right through into objective knowledge that notions about sympathetic understanding and kind of trying to rework in one's mind what some natural process is in ways that are like sympathetic understanding takes place too in the natural sciences. However, one might see Popper's embrace of the rationality principle as, in fact, making in some respects an accommodation with this tradition of Verstehen or sympathetic understanding, at least at the level of individual action. There is, on the one side, as it were, an interesting issue which has arisen in the methodology of economics, which relates to this. There's been a long-standing argument as to whether macroeconomics can, as it were, be self-standing, or whether an acceptable macroeconomic theory, in addition to being successful in terms of the explanations that it provides, also needs to have so-called micro foundations. Two issues might be raised here. The first is, in the physical sciences, don't we also have successful theories of the working of which we don't have micro level explanations. We might think it would be nice to have them, but at certain points we may not have them. And the second is that to the degree to which our theories in social science may make use of stylized representations of the individual, what is involved in making them rational may be rather thin and removed from what one might call the heuristic thrust of ideas about sympathetic understanding. I mean, what I'm trying to get at here is that you might have in some work in rational choice theory, the idea of individuals as having a preference structure which ranges over all the possible choices that might be open to them, and as having perfect knowledge about these alternatives, and then simply going for whatever gives them subjectively the best payoff. But there's quite a gulf between that and the sort of argument that says, well, in the social sciences, we're dealing with, individuals of the sort that we know from ourselves and from our friends and family with their characteristics, and which notes the difference between that and what is envisaged as going on in the natural sciences. This distinction is all well and good. The problem about it might seem to be that the kind of stylized and in many respects exaggerated representations of individuals that take place in the some of the social sciences seem equally far removed from the kind of flesh and blood individuals who are playing the role of being appealed to in the arguments about the difference between the natural and social sciences. Another kind of question can be raised here too. It relates to how we should understand Popper's idea of situational logic. Popper offered us a picture of individuals as acting in accordance with the logic of their situation. But as some discussion that I had with Popper, of which there's a residue in a footnote in the published version of Models, Instruments, and Truth, indicates, it may not be altogether clear what he's calling for. For we might ask, if an individual is seen as acting rationally in the situation in which they find themselves, how are we to understand that situation? Are we taking it that they're acting rationally in their situation as they understood it to be? This looks plausible, but it brings with it a problem, namely, how do we as third parties work out what we took their situation to be? Clearly, we can conjecture something which would have made an action which otherwise seems rather odd to be perfectly rational. But if there's a significant discrepancy between what we're attributing to their understanding and their actual situation, how, unless we are extremely lucky enough to have some additional evidence, can we actually appraise any such claim? Alternatively, we can work with the idea that their action was rational given the situation as it was, or as Popper suggests at one point, that they could have discovered it to be. But while such a claim is easier to assess and might be useful if we're making use of a model in which some macro level social event is understood as being the product of the actions of a lot of individuals, we face an obvious problem, which Popper himself acknowledges, that in some cases, people don't act in an objectively rational manner. Popper's example is that people might attempt to park their car in a parking place which is too small for it. Clearly, this may occur. It may be a result of misjudgment. They may simply have incorrectly assessed their situation. But equally, there can surely be occasions in which people do things which, even on the basis of their subjective assessment, don't make sense. For example, they may say, simply get frustrated, perhaps with an absence of parking places and the way other people have parked, and just sort of put their foot down. And they may persist with an action which they would like to be effective, even when in some sense they know that it won't be. It is in this setting that Popper, in effect, argues that we should retain the rationality principle and make modifications elsewhere in our explanatory system. This, as Alan Musgrave has commented, looks a bit like Popper adopting a Lakatosian approach and saving the rationality principle as the hard core of a research program. But on the face of it, we should, I think, try to explore what the alternatives might be. And I suspect that Popper thought that actually, if we gave up on the rationality principle, this might, in effect, amount to giving up on the attempt to explain. We just say, oh, they're behaving irrationally, and that's it. But it is possible that someone might come up with useful psychological theories in such cases. Popper, after his own turn away from pursuing studies in psychology, while believing in the existence and importance of World II, tended to be critical of psychologistic approaches. In his later work, he placed great emphasis upon World III, while in his writings about social science, he was critical of what he called psychologism. And I quote, the theory that sociology must in principle be reducible to social psychology. Against this, he championed a Marx-influenced institutional approach against a psychologistic approach. It's worth noting that in chapter 14 of The Open Society, Popper actually notes in a footnote that it was at Ernst Gombrich's prompting. Gombrich was trying to place the manuscript of The Open Society with the publisher and had some correspondence with Popper about the manuscript. And Popper, in response to Ernst Gombrich, inserted a clarification that he wasn't claiming that, I quote, psychological studies and discoveries are of little importance for the social scientist. His objection rather seems to have been to a claim that psychology should have a foundational role in relation to the social sciences, rather than just being one social science alongside others. That being said, however, it would seem to me that in the face of issues about non-rational behavior, as in the parking case, Popper might have been more explicitly open to the possible usefulness of well-tested psychological theories here. Popper, in Models, Instruments, and Truth, does go on to refer to psychoanalytic theory, but only to suggest how its analysis might actually be seen as extending a rationalistic approach to things that otherwise were baffling. I might also mention in passing that Popper himself, in fact, makes use of what might be seen as some psychological ideas in the course of his Open Society. For example, there is, you might recall, his theme of the strain of civilization. This he takes to be a recurrent psychological reaction to certain kinds of social change, and to have been important in people's critical reactions against an open society, right through from classical Greece to his own day. There is also a theme that Popper developed. I seem to recall him somewhere claiming that it goes back to his William James lectures, but I think it actually only dates to the Emory lectures that Popper gave, where he talks about people's psychological reaction to the notion that they're living in a fatherless society, one in which you just simply don't have the kind of epistemological authority on the part of social authority figures which people might have been used to in the past. Popper's ideas in this whole field seem to me to be interesting, but it's not obvious just what a Popperian approach in the social sciences would amount to. One might, despite some of the issues that I've noted, think of it as suggesting a rational choice approach, but there is Popper's commonalities with the institutional or social character of human action, which possibly weighs against that. Alternatively, it might be seen as closer to a Weberian approach in which we're concerned initially in the investigating of what meaningful behavior amounts to in different situations, and then exploring its consequences, intended and unintended. But on the face of it, what we choose will, I think, have to depend on the kinds of problems with which we're dealing. In addition, as I've indicated when I referred to the material that Popper introduced to the Open Society at Gombrich's prompting, it's not even clear that he would be opposed to the idea of introducing specific ideas about psychological motivation should they be relevant. For example, I earlier referred to Latsis's work on the methodology of economics, in which he made use of Lakatos in the course of defending a behavioral approach within the theory of the firm. This looked at specific concerns on the part of people who are in management roles in business against criticism by more orthodox neoclassical economics writers who thought it fine simply to make use of what had become more traditional approaches, which just assumed that firms as such maximize profits, and which doesn't think it useful to go into issues about, say, the knowledge or motivation of managers as such. In my view, it's possible that one might find points in Popper's work which are useful in relation to this and to other such controversies. But I'd have thought that they're likely to be spread across discussions of issues right across Popper's work. That is to say, I'm skeptical as to whether there is a clear-cut Popperian approach which suggests that a specific research program for work in the social sciences is to be found there. However, with an aim of refuting this, I plan to look in series 2 of these lectures, if it takes place, at Ian Jarvis' The Revolution in Anthropology, and at his and Agassiz The Rationality of Magic, to see making use of the self-consciously Popperian approaches that they take to see if I can refute my suggestion that I've made here, that there isn't a clear-cut Popperian approach to the methodology, to the substance of how one should use Popper's methodology within the social sciences. I'll stop at this point and I'll stop sharing, and let's then move on to discussion. Do please raise a hand if you'd like to criticize or ask questions about anything. John.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting and helpful. Yeah, I would say.
Well, I don't know about that.
Yes. No. Absolutely. No. I agree with some things. Disagree with others. One thing, because you talked about his reaction to Plato, that he somehow Plato was not really an issue so much. I think it seems to me what he might be getting at is there were some Platonists in the 19th century, like Spengler, Roscher of the historical school, Meinecke, Ottmar Spahn, who did mix historicism with a kind of Hegelian view of society. It seems to me that might be what Popper was on about when he emphasized Plato and historicism so much. Yeah?
Well, historicism was simply one of the charges that he lays against Plato in the course of his interpretation, and it's referred to also in the Poverty of Historicism. But I guess my view would be that, I mean, Popper had a lot of concerns in the Open Society and the Poverty of Historicism, but it would seem to me that he might have done better if he had just engaged directly with the work of contemporary social theorists, rather than trying to approach them in a slightly elliptical way by criticizing themes that he found in or attributed to other figures, which were kind of like what they seem to him to be talking about. Just on the grounds that it's not clear to me, and I gave this parallel with Hayek's discussion of Auguste Comte and other followers of Saint-Simon. It's just not clear to me that their contemporaries would actually have recognized themselves in the picture that was being painted there. I mean, it's not a big deal, but I just think that tactically, as it were, it was rather a strange move to make. Hassan, sorry, you wanted to get in on this? No, okay.
I just also throw out kind of a suggestion. It seems to me this is just very, very rough, yeah. That if we're going to sort of think about what Popper's a Popperian approach to social science might be, it seems to me it consists of the unity of scientific method. I think that was very important for him. That the methods of science should be for both natural and social sciences. Anti-psychologism, that is to say, institutional approach, like you mentioned. And his particular take on the rationality principle, which in Models and Instruments and Truth, he tries to conceive of a way of accounting for irrational action. And it seems to me irrational action could have an institutional explanation of it, you know, rather than a psychological one, yeah, because we get our perceptions of the world from institutions like education, like religion, etc., that might lead to irrationality. Just to throw that out there, maybe those are some points of departure.
Well, it's possible, but I guess I was trying to make 2 points. I mean, on the one side, it seems to me that if one is trying out a Popperian approach, it's not clear whether the rationality principle and situational logic mean doing what microeconomists do, or doing what those people who combine ethnology with then doing tests to see how representative some of the things they come up with are, and then exploring what some of the unintended consequences of action on the basis of this sort of thing would be. So it seemed to me that just on that score, the problem is that it didn't differentiate significantly between what in practical terms might be seen as competing approaches. The other thing is that the unity of the sciences, well, there is a notion of the unity of the sciences in Popper, and it is all about the use of the same structure of explanation and testability and so on, but where, and this is what I was trying to argue, that in many respects, people who were arguing for the distinctive character of the social sciences or of history.
Mises, for a good example. Yeah.
Well, people who are making this argument would typically say the difference lies in pretty much the kind of things that Popper was picking out in terms of the rationality principles. So, so one can certainly say, yes, I mean, he's a champion of the unity of the sciences. They equally face epistemological problems. There is the common structure of explanation, but at the same time, he's actually embracing but giving his own version of some of the things that other people were wanting to claim to mark the distinction.
Yeah, it's definitely a work in progress.
Okay,
for sure. Thank you, Jeremy.
Any other, Hassan?
I have a general question for you, Jeremy. After this discussion of some rational choice approaches and the Weberian approaches, social institutional approaches, my question is it possible at all to have an approach like a rational choice approach to human behavior to begin with? Think about, for example, a very simple example, when people, when little kids start to learn, for example, just simple arithmetic, and They have some mistakes in even simple addition and multiplication. Is there any possibility that mathematics, by its own methodology, mathematical methodology, would be able to explain these mistakes? Because these are just humanistic mistakes. If it was a machine, then by mathematics we could explain everything. But because people make mistakes, then mathematics is not enough. Psychology, for example, would explain those mistakes. When we see that there is no way to imagine people to behave completely rationally, then those irrational behaviors, those irrational choices, for example, must be explained in terms of either psychology or sociology. That's another thing. But my argument is that it's not possible at all to begin with to think about a rational choice approach to the methodology of social sciences, because they are talking about humans in which correct choices and incorrect choices, rational choices and irrational choices are just mixed. And there is no rational choice theory to explain those.
Look, you've raised what seemed to me to be a number of slightly different issues there. A rational choice approach is typically one which is concerned with understanding the products of human action as consequences of choices that people are making. And so, for example, economists might be concerned with issues like what is the likely impact of a change in income tax on the level of economic activity generally, on people's rates of saving, and various other more specific things. And the kind of way in which this is typically approached is by way of, in effect, offering models of individuals acting on the basis of a limited and simplified number of assumptions, and then working out what the effect on those actions is likely to be, assuming that people have got a particular scatter of preferences of having, for example, one tax rate or another, and so on. Now, in that setting, the issue of a rational choice approach looks pretty innocuous. You can also get it in other cases. I mean, there is a guy, I'm just trying to remember his name, who does what could be called rational choice sociology of religion. And one of the things that he got interested in was, how was it that the numbers of Christians multiplied so much in the very early Roman period? And what he came up with was the idea that at times of plague and similar kinds of difficulties, Christians taking the view that they were commanded to love one another and also would get an eternal payback for what they were doing, would then be inclined to look after one another in ways which even virtuous pagans wouldn't be motivated to do. And what he then came up with was that, in effect, with the particular kinds of problems that were being faced, even relatively minimal assistance, which carried a certain risk to it, in fact, boosted the numbers of people who are likely to survive these things in quite a dramatic way. And so what was going on there was that, again, he was interested in a sort of large scale outcome or problem, that it seemed sort of puzzling why there should have been this big increase and in relative numbers. And he offered this as a hypothesis about which there has then been argument and so on. But you can see the kind of thing that's going on. The second, the issue of how you understand the behavior of particular individuals is a rather different matter, because simply assuming their rationality as such isn't likely to be of direct help there. Although you can get to this issue of does it make sense to understand as a heuristic people acting rationally on the basis of their understanding of the situation that they were in, or as a competing hypothesis, does one invoke psychological hypotheses? And it seems to me that in the case of the kids that you were talking about, one interesting way to go is to say, well, typically what they're trying to do is to learn the grammatical rules that lie behind the particular language that they're encountering. And so, I mean, I simply don't know any current linguistics, but if there are Chomskyan structures around, it's clear that these only determine a certain amount of what's going on, and that if someone is learning a specific language, then they have to try to work out, say, what the rules are for making plurals and so on. And the mistakes will often be perfectly, in a certain sense, perfectly rational mistakes that someone might make in terms of sensible generalizations that someone might make to try to capture how a particular language works, and where in English especially the difficulty is that because its structure isn't particularly regular, they may be found making mistakes by assuming that the language is more rational than it actually is.
Okay, may I continue a bit?
Yes, of course.
But in some cases, the mistakes and the irrational choices and the irrational decisions cannot be explained in any sort of rationality. That just now, for example, people are using some brain wiring or something like that to explain how biases are interfering with our argumentation and with our choices. So I think the rational choice method has some limitations, because at some point the issue is such that only some brain explanations or evolutionary explanations or psychological explanations can explain that why people do such a thing.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree. I mean, some of what I was saying was effectively that it seemed to me that Popper should have been more open to psychological explanations than he was. I think all that one might say in his favor is that at the time at which he was writing, there was a lot of very poor quality psychologistic explanation around. But I'd agree completely. And I think that indeed, if you had things which were specific and testable, I'd be all in favor of that. Although clearly there may be a competing, well, there may be ways in which one can put up such explanations as competitors to rational choice ones. Okay, on that, I've got Margareta and then Philip. John, is your hand an old one or a young one?
It's a young one, but I can wait for
no, it's fine.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just needed to check where you were on the list.
Yeah.
So it'll be Margareta, Philip, and then John.
Yeah, I just wanted to reinforce what John said about anti-psychologism. And I personally think that argument hasn't been properly, that there's so much more work to be done, because it can be understood in what is called
Sorry, you're breaking
if we
up.
take the other side, the psychologists, they say, we know what's going on, there is a bias. But if you think about the language, what does a bias mean? That means that they know what the perfect answer is. And we're all biased because we're not giving the perfect answer. But actually, the reality is we don't know the answer. So if it's more appropriate to actually say there is maybe a blind spot, but the blind spot can be absolutely anything. So it's like we actually need other people to pick up the blind spot in our own thinking. And so we have now this computational theory of the mind, that is some guys or a couple of guys, or is von Neumann and Herbert Simon, they all think, wow, what a great idea. Let's think that our mind is a computer. And so now there are a whole bunch of people that also think, wow, what a great idea. My mind works like a computer. But that is a metaphor. And that is like a metaphysical research program that Popper talks about. And we need to recognize, yeah, it's a wonderful metaphor. We can do a lot with it, but there are limitations. And so now we're stuck in that everyone thinks, oh, this is the reality, while it's a metaphor. And I think that is precisely what Popper was trying to capture when he said psychologism is a bad idea. We need to think much more clearly and carefully about our methodological choices. And methodological choices, I've had a little conversation with John about that. It's like, it's about distinctions that we make. And now, is that something that belongs to methodology? Does that belong to logic? Is that philosophy? So the distinctions, making of distinctions, that's not psychology, that's for sure. I'm done.
Okay. All I would say is Popper's discussion of psychologism as such was really of an approach which was saying that everything had to be founded on a naturalistic psychology. And so that was his particular target, and he quotes Mill on that and so on. But yeah. I mean, I think you're right in saying there are different research programs here, but I guess my own thought about that would be to say, well, in some ways one has to see how the different programs respond to both theoretical problems, but also how they handle empirical problems and issues, and that there's only a limited amount that one can do by claiming that people are making methodological mistakes. Whereas I think that Popper really, for reasons that I've explained, I mean, namely because methodology was something that he thought he could discuss rationally at the time, tended to put a bit too much weight on that as distinct from what one could do making use of his later ideas, talking about the relative performance theoretically and empirically of different competing research programs. So I think we may not be in disagreement. Okay, Philip.
Thank you. I have a whole bunch of largely unconnected thoughts.
Are some of them connected with Popper or the lecture?
They're connected with your lecture, but they don't seem to cohere.
No,
very
that's
easily.
fine. I was going to say that otherwise it might suggest that you could be in the running for president of the US. But
well, there we go. So I'm
we'll try to
disqualified,
connect,
by the way.
We'll try to connect them after you give them. Okay.
There we go. Yeah. So picking up on something that I think John had made, and maybe also Hassan had referred to, the unity of science to some extent. I think that was mainly John's observation. Popper seems to talk about the unity of theoretical sciences, but he makes a distinction between the theoretical and the historical sciences, and history presumably is in the latter camp, and he is drawing a distinction between in the Poverty of Historicism. He's drawing a distinction between social science and sociology in general, which might test laws and might test them in much the same way that theoretical physics would do, and history, which he's arguing is without that. So that's a position that you have in the Poverty of Historicism. It seems to be rejected by the time we get to the 1960s. In the 1963 essay that you have referred to several times, Models, Instruments, and Truth, he says that the requirement for testing Newtonian-like laws in the social sciences is rarely can they be tested, rarely can they be explored, but that instead what you are dealing with in the social sciences is historical problem situations, and there seems to be this shift that perhaps Popper does not himself acknowledge, and which I didn't quite hear in your lecture. Maybe you have a different view on this.
Can we take these then one at a time?
Okay, that's good, because they don't really cohere. So
no, that's fine. I mean, what I'd say is he also discusses this issue in the interview on historical explanation. What I would say about it is he thinks that there is the same structure of explanation running right through, but in Models, Instruments, and Truth, he goes out of his way to stress that the rationality principle could play the same role as does a universal law, but within that structure of explanation. In the earlier stuff, he refers to various laws which might be made use of in history, and I said a bit about them in the lecture on Popper and history. They seem to me to be pretty feeble, and in effect, my view was that he says in that early stuff three things. He talks about rationality principle based explanations. He also talks about the way in which if there were two armies taking on one another, one might just assume, invoke, as it were, a generalization that the bigger one, other things being equal, would win. And there, my comment was, well, if this is questioned, you'd want to go back and look at the details of the particular case. All I did want to suggest by way of supporting him is that you might have ideas from the theoretical social sciences which could be brought in. For example, a historian could surely legitimately invoke notions about the way in which the government behaving in a particular way would actually give rise to inflation. And where this could be something which the historian might invoke, but which may actually not have been appreciated, or certainly might not have been appreciated in such terms by the historical agents. So I guess what I would say is I would certainly agree that there is a transition from feeble examples of historical laws, plus also discussion of rationality principle stuff, to really a discussion just of the rationality principle and a repudiation in that interview of the substantive laws. Although I'm suggesting that there is this small caveat to it, that there might be some stuff which actually could be brought in, but which Popper himself didn't have recourse to.
I think there's some very interesting things that you have said there. Before I move on to the second point, if I can just suggest two things. First, I think you're right about the historical explanation interview, as well as this 1963 paper that on models, instruments, and truth. It seems to me, however, they are part of Popper's shift that he didn't fully acknowledge at the time. And I think the shift is due to the republication of the Poverty of Historicism in 1957 and the very unanticipated critical response it received. You mentioned Marcuse's response. That was one of several that Popper, I think, was taken aback by and then had to reposition himself with. I mean, there's also, by the way, the 1961 debate with Adorno, which I think is part of, so each of these early 1960s restatements of his position shifts his position as it is restated. I think you raise a very interesting point about the status of the rationality principle, which is really my next question. But there is just one other thing that occurred to me in listening to your response, and that is that one of his apparent criticisms of historicism in the Poverty of Historicism is a criticism of those who claim that social situations are invariably, and so hence sociological laws are invariably historically bound. They're connected to a historical situation. It seems to me that there may have been a shift in Popper's view on that as well. That, in other words, you could have a logic of a specific historical situation that emerges in the early 1960s. It seems to be precisely the position his writings up to the publication of the Poverty of Historicism have rejected, at least in the early sections, if I remember, of the Poverty of Historicism. Okay.
Okay. All I would say is that he does refer to this idea of, I can't remember if it's explained trends or something other of this kind, which relate to a kind of generally occurring initial conditions. And it seems to, as I indicated in the talk, it seems to me that this actually gives room for a Marxist to say to him, look, actually, this is what we're talking about, and that if this occurs, it would explain how quite legitimately we can have laws that operate in a particular historical period. And effectively, my criticism that I was making of Popper was that he didn't actually engage with the strongest kind of case that you could make for Marxism at the time, and he tended instead to claim that people were making a number of methodological errors, which, if they had made these, could lie behind what they were saying, but where it actually seems to me to be more plausible that what they were wanting to do was something that was a little bit different. And I mean, I think it's a tricky matter, because in the interpretation of Marx, the kind of stuff that he was engaged with was in some ways the standard view amongst Marxists, as opposed to some sometimes fringe but very interesting academics. And one might say, well, Popper was fine to engage with the kind of people and the kind of views that he was finding people espousing. And it's striking that, for example, Cornforth, when he engages with Popper, basically sets out to try to defend exactly some of the things that Popper had, for perfectly just reasons, criticized. On the other hand, I mentioned in, I think, another lecture that Michael Evans, who was a colleague of mine at Manchester, had written really quite an interesting book about Marx, in which he said, in a certain sense, despite the statements which Popper can quote about the dynamics of history, it really looked as if what Marx was coming up with was stuff which was, for reasons that in effect this exception that Popper has noted could actually accommodate, would be restricted to specific historical situations.
Right. In fact, I think Popper may actually have. You don't want to accuse him of anything, but there was almost a misquoting of Marx, so that where Marx refers to what effectively are laws of development of what he called the modern society, Popper refers to this as laws of development of society, as if there is no such restriction.
Right.
You know, so I think there are a number of rather strange misstatements and possibly mistranslations, but you know, it's okay. My second point was incoherent point was going to be on the change of the rationality principle. I think there is a way of defending the rationality principle, and it is defended in the Poverty of Historicism as a methodological principle to not simply treat actions as irrational, if you will, and a requirement that we then therefore explain that. That shifts also in that 1963 paper. I cannot recall Popper before 1963 in that Models, Instruments, and Truth paper coming up with the idea that the rationality principle is itself a kind of universal law that will animate, like other universal laws might explain the animation of individuals in a particular situation. He refers to this directly, I think, on was it page 169 in the Myth of the Framework, where you find that, and there are several other occasions, I think, where he makes reference to that. It seems to me this is a very strange move for Popper to have made, and it is precisely almost I mean, he doesn't acknowledge it as a retreat to psychologism, but you wonder what is this possible animation of human motive, unless it is in the sense of attachment to larger idea systems, systems of that would have plastic control, if you will, on human social action, as he develops just 2 years later. That might be an approach. But I find that strange. Okay, let me.
Sorry, can I comment on that?
Yes.
Because I think that the explanation of that is much simpler, namely the role that the rationality principle is playing, and is spelled out there, is the role in a formal deductive explanation. So the animating isn't psychologistic. What he's talking about is drawing consequences, and where, as I tried to indicate in what I was saying, I mean, it seems to me in many respects what Popper does is to take over the kind of approach that Hayek saw as a subjectivistic explanation, and to say, no, this actually fits my model of nominalogical deductive explanation, but with the substantive law being replaced by the rationality principle. But all I would say about it is, I mean, he doesn't talk about that in the early writings, but it is clear that he is entertaining explanations using the rationality principle there, to the point where, but I think if someone had asked him at that point about it, he would have had to have said something like the later paper. In the later stuff, I think you're certainly right that he seems to have ditched the substantive universal laws as playing a role. Whether anything more hinges on that, you clearly think that it does and is importantly interconnected with a bunch of other things. I'm skeptical, but what I would say is I would like to read a paper by you which actually puts these things together and argues them.
Okay, challenge accepted. I will try that at some point. Okay, I think probably at this point I should bow up, because I think there's a couple of other people that are waiting. So, but I have a bunch of other points, but maybe on another occasion.
Okay, well, let's see, because we've got John who's coming back. But could I just see whether anyone else wants to raise anything too, just so that we can get a feel for what a queue might be? And okay, John.
I'm going to be so bold as to try and answer Philip's question with regard, because I've been having to grapple with models, instrument, and truth quite a bit in dealing with Mises and all. And there's a hint, perhaps, there's this speech that Popper gave when he was commemorating Hayek, the Communist Road to Self-Destruction, or whatever it was called, where he talks about Mises. It's in your After the Open Society, yeah, and you suggested it to me, which is quite useful. And he talks about Mises, and he mentions specifically that his rationality principle is based on that idea of objective rationality versus subjective rationality, because Mises' rationality principle is that any intentional action is ipso facto rational, whereas Popper delineates these three separate situations where that sort of account for the idea of irrational action. Yeah. So I think he is consistently trying to avoid psychologistic explanations. It's quite interesting that Popper's PhD, we often forget this, Popper's PhD was in psychology, and he almost had to do a PhD in psychology in order to reject psychology as a basis for social theory. And I think the anti-psychologism, which he derives from Marx, in fact, yeah, and in that chapter where he criticizes John Stuart Mill, is an effort to explain things on an institutional level. So I think he's aiming for this objective point of view, and that's why he emphasizes the situational logic so much, and tries to exactly how his idea of objective rationality is to be incorporated into the model is quite open. Yeah, I mean, I think what he's aiming at is sort of a way of explaining people's irrational actions on the basis of institutional structures that lead them to act individually for their individual action, which because of the way the institutional constraints exist, lead them to have unintended consequences later on. So I think he's trying to focus on the institutional approach to things. It's an institutionalist approach, and he wants to direct our attention to that, and that's got to be part of the model that he wants to set up. Yeah, that seems to be, I think, what he's getting at. Yeah.
Could I comment briefly? Because
certainly, yeah.
I think that by objective, one could have one of two different things in mind. Mm-hmm. One is the stuff that I stressed to Philip, namely that he is concerned with, as it were, an objective third world explanatory structure and the commonality of that, in Popper's view, across all areas of knowledge. As to the institutional stuff, I mean, Popper is talking about people acting in institutions, in social settings, and so on. But what people do, even if human relations officers in universities find it difficult to understand, not only isn't, but couldn't be specified by the role specification of the institution. But another element of it is that there is stuff in the social sciences where people have appealed to individuals' misunderstandings of things as having played a significant role. I mean, I am not any good at Keynesian economics, but you get ideas, for example, about a money illusion as being significant. I mean, people say not cottoning on to the fact that in some circumstances, a pound or a dollar may not actually be worth what it was, and in consequence, taking what from their own perspective are bad decisions because they really haven't cottoned on to the full aspects of the situation that they're in. And in a similar kind of way, there are.
I was just going to say, much to the chagrin of Austrian economics.
No, because the Austrians are actually people who stress the subjective, and I mean, for them, for people to be mistaken about things is still acting rationally. Because
no, I meant that they're so in favor of the gold standard and an objective aspect that money is essentialized to a certain extent. Yeah.
Some of them are, but look, a key issue is surely going to be that in lots of historical cases, typically whenever there are battles that are fought, one of the generals at least has typically assessed very badly what the situation is that he's in a similar kind of way. I mean, the sociology of religion, which is an interest of mine.
I think he quotes Winston Churchill in that regard, right? About battles are not won, but they're lost by the other side.
Yeah. But all I'm saying is that such historical cases are full of people who have misassessed what the situation is that they're in. And similarly, I mean, all kinds of stuff in the sociology of religion is really all about people's misunderstandings of things. I mean, this isn't to put down to the religious, but there are all kinds of things that really need to be teased out about how particular views are maintained and all sorts of stuff of that kind. So I mean, you might be able to argue your case, John, and to say that he is working with a very strong notion of, as it were, institutional determinism, but I'd be a wee bit skeptical about it still. Now, Margarete.
It's always good to be a wee bit skeptical.
No, that's fine.
I wanted to just reaffirm some comments that maybe John actually made indirectly, that this, when he talks about subjective and objective knowledge, then the three-world hypothesis comes to mind. That a paper needs to be read at some point about that rationality principle and the relation with Popper's three-world hypothesis. I think about it as a methodological hypothesis, more about key distinctions that we need to make before we start arguing. And so I think there is an opportunity for more work here that might help understand what's going on in the social sciences much better.
All I would say is that Popper's line is very much that you shouldn't try to clarify things before you start arguing. You should only clarify them if it turns out in the course of your argument that you think you're talking across purposes.
Yeah, but there's exactly somewhere there in what you just told me, there is somewhere there the three-world hypothesis, and maybe this is today not the time.
For Popper, as for Popper, an explanation is a third world object.
Yeah.
And so what he wants to stress is the construction of something where what you're trying to explain actually follows logically from your premises, and where there's also testability. But the oddity of what Popper is doing in rationality principle cases is that he is using in that a representation of the very things that the people who've been taking a kind of difference between the social sciences and the natural sciences approach mark of distinction, because Popper's rationality principle is, as it were, an objectified, in the sense of a third world version of the sort of stuff that they're talking about. Okay, any further points, or do we pack up a little bit early tonight? Okay. No one is rushing forward. So thank you very much. Next time it is ethics, Popper and ethics. The next time Popper and aesthetics. And then the final one is going to be on Popper, the person.
Thank you very, very much, Jeremy.
Fine.
Bye-bye.
Cheerio. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.